Rome carried water across mountains and valleys on gradients so slight the eye could barely see them. Its ports fed a capital of hundreds of thousands. Its roads connected armies, farms, cities, and frontiers across 3 continents. And yet the Western Empire eventually lost the ability to keep parts of that system working. Not because Roman engineers forgot how to build, because the institutions behind the engineering could no longer maintain every promise carved in stone. This is the Aqua Claudia. Completed under Claudius in the 1st century, it became one of Rome's great high-level aqueducts. It was also troubled almost from the beginning. Its supply was interrupted. Vespasian restored it. Titus repaired it again. Later generations reinforced arches, sealed leaks, relined channels, and built new masonry around old masonry. That history is visible in the structure itself. Original concrete beneath brick reinforcement. Waterproof lining beneath limestone deposits. One intervention resting on another. Repair is not failure. Repair is how infrastructure survives. But there is a point where a system stops being renewed and begins to be merely kept alive. A leak is sealed without opening the wall. A narrowed channel is cleaned without removing the obstruction that keeps returning. Each decision is reasonable. Each one is cheaper than rebuilding. And each one leaves the next generation with less room, less capacity, and a more complicated problem. That is how decline often looks up close. Not a single collapse. A chain of temporary decisions that become permanent. The Aqua Traiana reveals another side of the same problem. Dedicated in 109, it gathered water from springs around Lake Bracciano and carried it toward the western districts of Rome. Its source was not one dramatic river intake. It was a network of spring houses, vaulted capture galleries, branches, conduits, and inspection points spread across a landscape. That made the system resilient. It also made it demanding. Every source had to remain clear. Every settling chamber had to be emptied. Every wall had to remain watertight. Every landowner, work crew, official, and budget had to cooperate across distance and time. The engineering did not end when the aqueduct opened. Opening day was when the maintenance obligation began. Rome's harbor at Portus magnified that obligation. Claudius created a vast outer basin near the mouth of the Tiber. Trajan added the famous hexagonal harbor, canals, warehouses, quays, and administrative buildings. Grain, oil, wine, marble, animals, and people passed through a machine built at the scale of an empire. But Portus stood where river, sea, wind, and sediment fought over the same ground. Silt entered channels. Shorelines shifted. Basins had to be dredged. Entrances had to be protected. Larger ships required reliable depth, while warehouses and canals had to remain connected to the river and to Rome. The harbor did not suddenly become useless. Archaeology shows activity continuing for centuries. But the cost of keeping the whole system integrated rose as political and economic conditions changed. That is the deeper point. Great infrastructure does not defeat nature. It creates a permanent appointment with nature, and missing that appointment has consequences. Now go back to the year 27, to Fidenae, just north of Rome. A freedman named Attilius built a wooden amphitheater for profit. According to Tacitus, the foundations were inadequate, and the timber framing was not strong enough. During a crowded gladiatorial show, the structure failed. Ancient casualty figures differ, and may be exaggerated, but both Tacitus and Suetonius describe destruction on a horrifying scale. Tens of thousands killed or injured. The disaster was not an unavoidable act of nature. It was a governance failure made physical. A builder cut costs. A crowd trusted the structure. Oversight failed before the timber did. Afterward, the Senate restricted who could stage gladiatorial shows and required stronger financial qualifications. Rome responded. It wrote rules in the language of blood and debris. But regulations are not self-enforcing. A law can outlive the inspectors who once gave it meaning. Standards can remain on the books while political attention moves elsewhere. The lesson of Fidenae is not that Rome never learned. It is that civilizations must keep relearning the same lesson, because profit, urgency, and ambition never stop testing it. Even the Cloaca Maxima is less a story of one design flaw than a story of dependence. It began as a monumental drainage channel and evolved into part of Rome's sewer network. Aqueduct water that had already served fountains, baths, and homes helped flush waste through drains toward the Tiber. Streets, sewers, water supply, river level, and maintenance crews formed one connected system. The cloaca could endure floods and carry immense volumes, but its success depended on water continuing to flow and passages continuing to be cleared. A blocked drain could flood a street. A damaged aqueduct could reduce flushing. A rising river could force water backward. The more connected a system becomes, the more places a failure can travel. Rome also spent engineering talent on projects whose value was political rather than practical. After the fire of 64, Nero built the Domus Aurea across a vast landscaped estate in central Rome, with gardens, pavilions, lavish rooms, and an artificial lake in the valley where the Colosseum would later stand. It was an extraordinary technical and artistic achievement. It was also a monument to one ruler's priorities. Caligula's bridge across the Bay of Baiae was even more temporary. Merchant ships were anchored in two lines, covered with timbers and earth, and made to resemble the Appian Way. The emperor crossed it in a spectacular procession. Then the spectacle ended. The problem is not that spectacle exists. Rome had always used monuments, games, and public works to create legitimacy. The problem begins when prestige projects compete with systems whose success is invisible. Drains that do not overflow, roads that remain passable, retaining walls that do not move, and aqueducts that deliver the same water tomorrow. A palace receives applause when it opens. Maintenance receives attention only when it fails. The Via Appia makes that invisible work clear. Through the Pontine marshes, the road was not merely a pavement. It was a causeway linked to ditches, bridges, embankments, way stations, and a canal that could carry travelers and freight when conditions demanded it. The road survived because the landscape around the road was managed. Let the drainage channels fill, and water reaches the roadbed. Let the shoulders erode, and the paving loses support. Delay one repair season, and the next repair becomes larger. A military column does not need the entire highway to vanish. One failed bridge, one flooded causeway, or one broken supply wagon can turn days into weeks. An empire is not held together by lines on a map. It is held together by travel times. So why would a civilization capable of building systems like these struggle to maintain them? Joseph Tainter offers one influential answer: declining returns from complexity. Societies solve problems by adding organization. More officials, more specialists, more taxes, more military units, more depots, courts, regulations, and lines of communication. At first, each new layer produces enormous gains. A road opens a province. A tax office funds an army. An aqueduct supports a city. But complexity has an operating cost. Officials must be paid. Records must be copied. Garrisons must be supplied. Roads must be inspected. Every solution creates new assets and new obligations. Eventually, the next layer can cost more while producing less. That does not mean complexity is bad. It means complexity must keep justifying its expense. When population falls, tax collection weakens, civil wars interrupt trade, and frontiers demand more troops. The same imperial machine becomes harder to finance. The Western Empire did not lose every skill at once. It lost the reliable coordination that allowed skills, money, materials, and authority to arrive at the same place at the same time. Tainter interprets collapse as a rapid loss of socio-political complexity. Under that view, some successor states were not simply failed copies of Rome. They were smaller systems operating at a scale their available resources could support. That interpretation is debated, and it matters that the Eastern Roman Empire adapted and survived for centuries. Rome did not have one universal ending. Arnold Toynbee offered a different lens: challenge and response. The early republic repeatedly faced military and political threats and changed itself in response. It reorganized armies, expanded alliances, built roads, created colonies, and adapted law. Challenge produced invention. By the 3rd century, the empire faced civil war, invasion, epidemic disease, inflation, and rapid changes of emperor. The challenge was not one enemy at one gate. It was several crises arriving through the same overstretched system. Diocletian helped restore order. He divided authority, expanded administration, reorganized taxation, strengthened military command, and tried to impose stability on prices and occupations. The empire survived the 3rd century crisis, but the cure carried costs. More administration required more revenue. More control reduced some kinds of flexibility. Stabilization made the state stronger in the short term, while making it heavier to operate. This is where Peter Turchin's idea of elite overproduction becomes useful as a modern interpretive lens. When too many ambitious people compete for too few positions of power, status competition intensifies. Public office becomes a prize. Institutions become arenas for rivalry. Resources flow toward visible victories and away from unglamorous obligations. The Roman evidence does not fit one formula perfectly. History never does. But the pattern is recognizable. Elites can remain insulated from deterioration long after ordinary systems begin transmitting pain. And none of this requires cartoonish decadence. The most dangerous stage is quieter, short-termism. An official approves a festival because the crowd will see it today. A landowner delays drainage work because the flood may come after his term. A contractor covers a crack because opening the structure would expose a larger bill. A government funds emergency repairs because full replacement takes longer than an election cycle. Every decision can be rational for the person making it. Together, they can be fatal for the system. Here is what should unsettle you. These failures did not wait until Rome looked weak. Repairs accumulated while monuments still stood. Harbor traffic continued while channels demanded more work. Laws existed while enforcement varied. Armies still marched while the machinery behind them became more expensive and less reliable. The seeds of decline are often planted at the peak, when success is still visible and the cost of sustaining it is easiest to ignore. So, are we next? The honest answer is that history does not repeat like a machine, and modern states are not ancient Rome. An analogy is not a prophecy. But arithmetic still matters. In the United States, the top 1% now owns nearly as much household wealth as the entire bottom 90%. Federal civilian and military building maintenance backlogs reached roughly $370 billion by 2024. In 2025, civil engineers gave the nation an overall infrastructure grade of C, while roads, stormwater, transit, wastewater, dams, levees, and energy remained in the D range. We possess sensors, satellites, models, databases, engineering standards, and materials Rome could not imagine. Information is not our shortage. The shortage is sustained attention, the willingness to spend money before failure becomes spectacle, to rebuild foundations instead of repeatedly repairing surfaces, and to accept that every great system sends a bill long after the ribbon-cutting ends. Rome did not fall because concrete stopped working. Engineering failure was not the single cause of imperial decline. It was a symptom, a warning, and eventually a multiplier. When institutions weakened, water systems, roads, ports, drains, supply chains, and defenses became harder to coordinate. Each failure increased the pressure on everything still functioning. Rome's genius was the ability to build at civilizational scale. Rome's weakness was the growing difficulty of maintaining that scale through political crisis, economic strain, and changing priorities. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that greatness is rented, and maintenance is the rent. This channel reconstructs one Roman system at a time, not only to admire what Rome built, but to understand what every generation must do to keep a complex world alive. If that is why you are here, subscribe. There is still a great deal left to build.